Hello, all loyal readers, listeners, and others. I hope you enjoyed Pressure to Mutilate, the first in my romance novel series. My new release is titled Brave Love. I hope you will enjoy this one as well. You can download free PDF versions of these books on the website lovestories.com. LOVSTORIES.com. LOVSTORIES.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Here we go with Chapter 1 of this new release, Brave Love. Aisha sat on the dirt forest floor with hundreds of other young women, frightened to no end. Standing over the cowering women were dozens of well-armed terrorists who had carried out a major kidnapping at a school hours earlier, and Aisha was among the victims. She thought her chances of surviving the calamity were nil, and the unfortunate and bitter implication of that would be an eternal separation from her beloved family, of her parents and two other brothers, and her fiancé, a tall and handsome man named Ahmad. The kidnapping had occurred on a Saturday night, a day before Ahmad was to visit with her at the boarding school where Aisha was in her final year of high school, preparing to sit for her examinations and looking forward to marriage to Ahmad immediately after her graduation from high school. But all of this was now at the back recesses of her mind as she cowered before her kidnappers, her heart racing so fast she felt it would rip out of her chest. The traumatic events of the previous night played in her mind over and over again like a broken record. The terrorists had arrived in several large flatbed trucks and were armed with AK-47 rifles. They had overpowered lightly armed security guards to gain access to the sprawling school compound, where they quickly found out to secure two large buildings used as dormitories. The sleeping women, awakened minutes earlier by the sound of gunfire, were captured after the terrorists shut off the doors to the buildings, swarmed inside, and ordered the women to the floor. They were then herded out of the compound into the waiting getaway trucks. The terrorists took off, firing wildly into the air to scare their victims and potential rescuers. The daring operation had lasted all of just 20 minutes. The trucks traveled for 2 hours along an asphalted road before turning onto a lonely dirt road that led to the forest base of the ZOBBO organization, a homegrown movement that had declared a jihad on the state. The ZOBBO organization had published its goals, and they included the establishment of a theocracy in a country evenly split between Christians and Muslims, the banning of sporting events, and the elimination of cultural manifestations of Western civilization such as rock music, beauty pageants, and films. And it intended to achieve these goals through violent means. In the course of several years, the ZOBBO organization carried out attacks against government forces, blew up buildings, open marketplaces, churches and mosques, assassinated public officials, robbed banks to finance its operations, and kidnapped for ransom. The spectacular raid on Aisha's school was its latest act of infamy in its relentless drive to achieve its utopian goals. The trucks carrying the abducted women kept up a lone bush road deep into the forest. It was still early dawn, and there were no military checkpoints on the roads. The getaway had thus been easy for the terrorists. They arrived at a location where the trucks could go no further, and the women were ordered to disembark. Birds flew and perched on branches in the intimidating forest of huge trees. Squirrels and other little critters scurried around. Aisha had never been inside of a forest before in her 19 years of life on Earth. The combination of awe of the forest, the uncertainty of her fate in the hands of her captors, and her sight of the weapons they wielded was overwhelming. She and the rest of the captives hung their heads down and avoided eye contact with the terrorists after their leader, a wiry man who looked anorexic, had commanded them to do so or risked being shot. What Aisha had wished she could do during those moments of tremendous agony was to call Ahmad to apprise him about what had happened. But her cell phone, as were those that belonged to her colleague captives, had been confiscated by the terrorists. Even if she had her phone, there was no chance in hell that she could make the call without being shot. Ahmad would therefore remain oblivious of the life-changing event that was happening to her inside the God-forsaken forest. Ahmad was actually asleep at the time that the awful kidnapping had taken place. Ahmad lived in a city about 4 hours away from Aisha's school. He was an ex-soldier and a businessman who owned 3 restaurants and a large store that sold expensive Persian rug and household furniture. He had met Aisha during a military deployment in Aisha's hometown, where terrorists had been engaged in sabotage of civilian infrastructure and attacks on military posts. Aisha's curves, round face, and full chest had attracted his attention when she had walked past his checkpoint en route to a nearby local market. He braced himself to talk to her on her way back. About an hour later, as Aisha approached his location a second time, he was ready. "Hello, young lady," he had greeted her. "Hello," Aisha greeted back. "I have never seen a girl as beautiful as you are in all my life," he said to her, trying to charm his way into her heart. Aisha smiled, but kept on walking. By her culture, it would have been considered immodest for her to have stopped to chat with a total male stranger. Ahmad, brought up in this culture as well, understood her demurring and ignoring of his bold move on her. But he resolved not to be discouraged from pursuing her. At 25 years old and a sergeant in the military, he had been thinking about marriage. His father had also been putting pressure on him lately to do it. Ahmad's dad died 6 months after his first encounter with Aisha. He had died suddenly, and Ahmad was compelled to truncate his military career to take control of his father's businesses. But before the tragedy, Ahmad did have additional encounters with Aisha at that military checkpoint, and he had wormed his way into her heart. After snubbing him a few more times, she had surprised him one day when she stopped to chat with him. She had been impressed with his persistence and thought he could be a serious suitor. She was in her senior year of high school and was culturally ripe for marriage. He proposed to her, and she had accepted on the condition that he allowed her to finish her final year of secondary school education. Ahmad lazily got out of bed and went into the bathroom to brush and take a bath. As was his habit, he switched on the television in the living room, then kept the door to the bathroom ajar so he could listen to the news while he bathed. He was a few minutes into his bathing when the news anchor alerted her viewers to breaking news, and it was about a daring kidnapping of hundreds of secondary school girls by terrorists. Ahmad turned off the shower for a moment so he could clearly hear the words of the news anchor. Having once served in the military, he had a keen interest in security issues, but nothing prepared him for the jolt he felt when the news anchor provided details of the kidnapping. That it had occurred at the secondary school Aisha attended, and that deadly terrorists had carried out the crime. Ahmad toweled up immediately, without washing off the soap suds on his body, and scooted into the living room to stand directly in front of the television. The news anchor now had a national security analyst on the phone for his perspective on what had just occurred. Ahmad reached out for his phone on the center table. He tapped on Aisha's number, and it rang several times without a response from the other end. He tapped on it again and again with the same outcome: no response from Aisha. At that moment, Ahmad assumed the worst. Ahmad's imagination of awful things being meted out to Aisha and the rest of the abducted unfortunate souls actually played out in real time in the bowels of a forest several hours away. When the news anchor had interrupted regular programming with news of the abductions, the women were at that moment being marched deep into the forest to a hidden and well-fortified camp of the terrorists. A large plastic bag held the 200 phones seized from the women. The phones rang repeatedly, presumably from the concerned families of the women. Aisha figured her phone was among the ringing phones, as she suspected that her relatives and fiancé, informed about the catastrophe that had befallen her, were seeking to reach her. The trek had been going on for about an hour, and some of the women began to tire, making them to walk slowly to demonstrate that fact. But the terrorists were in no mood to permit their captives a rest. They operated on a clock and appeared determined to get to their camp by a certain time only known to them. They barked at the women to walk quicker. Tijani, the leader of the terrorists, wore a pair of jeans and a soiled green shirt. A bandana was tied around his small head, and he wore a face mask. He slung an AK-47 rifle and constantly gave directions to his men in the course of the march, telling them the paths in the forest to avoid and ordering them to mute all the phones in the bag after he became concerned about the signals betraying their location in the forest. The camp came into view after 2 hours of trekking in the foreboding forest. It was now full daylight, and the sun, A big yellowish ball in the sky was up in the east. Suddenly the noise of a warplane streaking through the skies on a bombing run was heard, and Tyranny barked orders for everyone to duck behind the trees on both sides of the footpath. There they remained for about an hour before resuming the trek. Aisha and the rest of the captives were not only worried about their fate at the hands of the terrorists, but they were also concerned about being collateral casualties in the war between the national authorities and the terrorists. The bombing, which had just occurred, portended a dangerous future, and Aisha was so traumatized and hopeless that she contemplated suicide. The first chance she got to be alone in captivity, she decided she was going to take her own life. She thought about her family and Ahmad. She would miss them, particularly Ahmad, whom she looked forward to marrying and starting up a family with. But the foreboding existence that stared her in the face as she walked on tired feet, the continual barking by the terrorists was most certainly likely to be Kafkaesque and grossly intolerable. A life with her sweetheart now seemed a long shot from being realized. Ahmad had visited with her 2 weeks before the kidnapping. They talked on the phone practically every day, and he paid her bi-weekly visits at the school. During his last visit, he had treated her to a nice dinner at a trendy restaurant. They dined on lamb, rice, stew, and ice cream, and had talked about their future together as a married couple. He planned to grow the business he had inherited from his father. She would enroll in the university, and he would support her financially. They would move to Dubai at some point and raise a family there. The business back home would remain, but he would open a new business in Dubai. The future looked bright for Aisha until the unspeakable tragedy that had occurred to her. The country seemed to be awash in crime and the terror activities of the ZOBBO organization. Many citizens were victims of kidnapping for ransom and sundry criminalities, but nothing on the scale of the mass abductions at the secondary school had ever happened before in the country. Aisha went in and out of suicidal thoughts. She came out of them only when her inner strength willed her to keep her hopes high. Perchance the incident would stoke international outrage and spur military action to rescue the captives. Such an operation had risks, and the captives could be killed in crossfire. This possibility often canceled out her hopes as she drifted in and out of suicidal thoughts. Aisha was a mental and psychological wreck by the time the captives reached the camp. End of chapter 1.